Hello, welcome to the Self Learning Podcast by Dr. Sushma Singh. Let us start discussion on Chapter 2, the demographic structure of the Indian society. And our topic is some theories and concepts in demography. The first one is Malthusian theory of population growth. Among the most famous theories of democracy is the one associated with the English political economist Thomas Robert Malthus, 1766 to 1834. Malthus' theory of population growth, outlined in his essay on population 1798, was a rather pessimistic one. He argued that the human populations tend to grow at a much faster rate than the rate at which the means of human subsistence, especially food, but also clothing and other agriculture based products, can grow. Therefore, humanity is condemned to live in poverty forever because the growth of agricultural production will always be overtaken by population growth. While population rises in geometrical progression like 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, etc., agricultural production can only grow in arithmetic like 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, etc., because population growth always outstrips growth in production of subsistence resources. The only way to increase prosperity is by controlling the growth of population. Unfortunately, humanity has only a limited ability to voluntarily reduce the growth of its population through preventative checks such as postponing marriages or practicing sexual abstinence or celibacy. Malthus believed, therefore, that the positive checks to population growth in the form of famines and diseases were inevitable because they were nature's way of dealing with the imbalance between food supply and increasing population. Malthus' theory was influential for a long time, but it was also challenged by theorists who claimed that the economic growth could outstrip population growth. However, the most effective refutation of this theory was provided by the historical experience of European countries. The pattern of population growth began to change in the later half of the 19th century. And by the end of the first quarter of the 20th century, these changes were quite dramatic. Birth rates had declined, and outbreaks of epidemic diseases were being controlled. Malthus' predictions were proved false because both food production and standards of living continued to rise despite the rapid growth of population. Malthus was also criticized by liberal and Marxist scholars for asserting that poverty was caused by population growth. The critics argued that the problems like poverty and starvation were caused by the unequal distribution of economic resources rather than population growth. An unjust social system allowed a wealthy and privileged minority to live in luxury, while the vast majority of the people were forced to live in poverty. The next theory is the theory of demographic transition. Another significant theory in demography is the theory of demographic transition. This suggests that the population growth is linked to overall levels of economic development and that every society follows a typical pattern of development. Related population growth. There are three basic phases of population growth. The first stage is that the low population growth in a society that is underdeveloped and technologically backward. Growth rates are low because both the death rate and the birth rate are very high, so that the difference between the two, or the net growth rate, is low. The third and last stage is also one of low growth in a developed society where both death rate and birth rate have been reduced considerably and the difference them is again small. Between these two stages is a transitional stage of movement from a backward to an advanced stage, and this stage is characterized by very high rates of growth of population. This population explosion happens because death rates are brought down relatively quickly through advanced method of disease control, public health, and better nutrition. However, it takes longer for society to adjust to change and alter its reproductive behavior, which was evolved during the period of poverty and high death rates, to suit the new situation of relative prosperity and longer lifespans. This kind of transition was effected in Western Europe during the late 19th and early 20th century. More or less similar patterns are followed in the less developed countries that are struggling to reduce the birth rate in keeping with the falling mortality rate. In India too, the demographic transition is not yet complete, as the mortality rate has been reduced but the birth rate has not been brought down to the same extent. Now, the next topic is common concepts and indicators. Most demographic concepts are expressed as rates or ratios. They involve two numbers. One of these numbers is the particular statistic that has been calculated on a specific geographical administrative unit. The other number provides a standard for comparison. For example, the birth rate is the total number of live births in particular area, an entire country, a state, a district, or other territorial unit during a specific period, usually a year, divided by the total population of that area in thousands. In other words, the birth rate is the number of live births per thousand population. The death rate is a similar statistic expressed as the number of deaths in a given area during a given time per thousand population. These statistics depend on the reporting of birth and deaths by the families in which they occur. In fact, in most countries, including India, people are required by law to report births and deaths to appropriate authorities. The local police station or primary health center in the case of villages and relevant municipal office in the case of towns and cities. The rate of natural increase or growth of rate of population refers to the difference between the birth rate and death rate. When this difference is zero or in practice very small, then we say that the population has stabilized or has reached the replacement level, which is the rate of growth required for new generations to replace the older ones that are dying out. Sometimes societies can experience a negative growth rate, that is, their fertility levels are below the replacement rate. This is true of many countries and regions in the world today, such as Japan, Russia, Italy, and Eastern Europe. On the other hand, some societies experience very high growth rates, particularly when they are going through the demographic transition described on the previous page. The fertility rate refers to the small number of live births per thousands women in the childbearing age group, usually taken to be 15 to 49 years. But like the other rates discussed on the previous, the birth and death rate, this is a crude rate. It is a rough average for an entire population and does not take account of the differences across age groups. Differences across age groups can sometimes be very significant in affecting the meaning of indicators. That is why demographers also calculate age specific rates. The total fertility rate refers to the total number of live births that a hypothetical woman would have if she lived through the reproductive age group and had the average number of babies in each segment of this age group as determined by the age specific fertility rates for that area. Another way of expressing this is that the total fertility rate is the average number of births to the cohort of women up to the end of the reproductive age period, estimated on the basis of age specific rates observed during a given period. Now, let us wind up the session and thank you very much for engaging yourself with the Self Learning Podcast.